It was early October 2020, and I was house-sitting for my old college professor, Dr. Clark. He was spending 2 weeks abroad for a research project and needed someone to look after his home and his cat, Millie. The house was a beautiful Victorian-style place in a quiet neighborhood, full of antique furniture and creaky wooden floors. It felt a bit like stepping into another era, with its high ceilings, intricate wallpaper, and dim lighting. Dr. Clark gave me a thorough walkthrough before he left, showing me where everything was, the thermostat, the spare keys, the basement where the water heater was located. But when we reached the upstairs hallway, he stopped in front of one door. "This room stays locked," he said, his tone firm. "Don't go in there. There's nothing you'll need inside." It was an odd request, but I nodded, not wanting to pry. Everyone has their quirks, and if he didn't want me in that room, that was fine by me. The first few days were uneventful. Millie was an easygoing cat, the kind who loved to lounge in sunny spots and barely noticed my presence unless it was mealtime. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the smallest sound seem magnified, the hum of the fridge, the groan of the old pipes, the soft creak of the floors as I walked around. But on the fourth night, the unease began to creep in. I was lying on the couch, reading a book, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on the floor above me. At first, I thought it was Millie, but when I glanced over, she was curled up in her bed, fast asleep. The sound continued for a few moments, then stopped abruptly. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, telling myself it was just the house settling. Old homes made noises, didn't they? But something about the sound, slow, deliberate, didn't feel random. The next night, the sound came again, around the same time. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard it, a faint thump, followed by another creak. It was coming from upstairs, near the locked bedroom. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response. I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs, my steps slow and cautious. The hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the window. I stood in front of the locked door, listening. The air felt colder here, heavier somehow. The sound came again, soft but distinct, a shuffle, like someone moving inside the room. I placed my hand on the doorknob, hesitating. Dr. Clark's warning echoed in my mind. The room was locked, and he told me not to go in. But my curiosity got the better of me. I tried the knob, but it didn't budge. The lock was firm. I knelt down, shining the flashlight under the door. There was only darkness on the other side, but as I stared, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of shadow. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, telling myself I was imagining things. That night, I slept with the lights on, Millie curled protectively at the foot of my bed. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wind against the windows. I told myself I was being paranoid, letting the isolation and the unfamiliar setting get to me. But the next day, something happened that made me question everything. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open upstairs. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening, as slow, deliberate footsteps moved across the floor above me. This wasn't the random groan of an old house. Someone, or something, was up there. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept up the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. The hallway was empty, the doors all closed except for one. The locked bedroom door was slightly ajar. I stared at it, my breath hitching. Dr. Clark had made it clear that the room was to stay locked. How was it open now? My hand shook as I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. My flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing old furniture draped in white sheets, a tall wardrobe, and a bedframe stripped of its mattress. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, etched into the wooden floor, was a series of deep scratches, like claw marks. They formed a strange, circular pattern, almost like a symbol. Around it were scattered fragments of wax, as if candles had once burned there. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My hands were trembling as I called Dr. Clark, my voice barely steady. "Something's wrong with the house," I said. "The locked room, I think someone's been in there." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Dr. Clark finally spoke, his voice was tight. "Did you go inside?" "I didn't mean to," I stammered. "The door was open." Another pause. Then, in a tone that sent chills down my spine, he said, "Get out of the house. Now." I didn't wait for an explanation. I grabbed my bag, scooped up Millie, and bolted out the door. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the windows. Dr. Clark never told me what was in that room. He refused to discuss it when he returned, brushing off my questions with vague reassurances. I never went back to that house, and I didn't keep in touch with him after that. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those scratches on the floor, the faint metallic smell in the air, and the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. And I wonder what I would have found if I'd stayed. In the fall of 2017, I moved into my first apartment. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom on the second floor of a creaky old building on the outskirts of town, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. I was 23, working 2 part-time jobs, and thrilled to finally have my own space. The building itself was old, with faded carpets and walls that seemed to echo every footstep. Most of the tenants were older, the kind of people who kept to themselves, which suited me just fine. My landlord lived on the ground floor and was friendly enough, always quick with a smile when I passed him in the hallway. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I spent my nights watching TV, scrolling through my phone, and enjoying the freedom of living alone. But as the nights grew colder and the days shorter, things started to change. It started with the noises. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of an old building, creaking pipes, the groan of the floorboards as someone walked down the hall. But these noises were different. They were faint, almost imperceptible at first, like whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard it for the first time, soft, muffled laughter coming from upstairs. It struck me as odd because I was certain the apartment above mine was vacant. The landlord had mentioned it during my tour, saying it had been empty for months. I figured maybe someone had moved in without me noticing, or the landlord was cleaning out the space. I brushed it off and went to bed, but the laughter stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I drifted off to sleep. Over the next few nights, the laughter continued. It always came at the same time, just after midnight, and lasted for only a few minutes. It was soft, like someone trying to keep it quiet, but there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't joyful or playful, it was strange, almost mocking. I asked my landlord about it one afternoon when I bumped into him in the hallway. "Has someone moved into the apartment upstairs?" I asked casually. He frowned and shook his head. "No, it's still empty." "Why?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "I've just been hearing noises, that's all." He gave me a curious look but didn't press further. "Old building," he said with a shrug. "It makes noises." That night, the laughter returned, louder this time. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then it stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving back and forth directly above me. My heart raced as I realized there was no carpet in the upstairs apartment, it was all hardwood flooring. The sound of shoes on wood was unmistakable. I grabbed my phone and dialed my landlord's number. He picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy. "Sorry to bother you," I said quickly, "but I think someone's in the apartment upstairs." There was a pause. "That's not possible," he said. "I locked it myself. No one's been up there." "Well, someone is," I insisted, my voice trembling. "I can hear them walking around." He agreed to come check it out, but by the time he arrived, the noises had stopped. We went upstairs together, and he unlocked the door to the vacant apartment. The air inside was stale and cold, the faint smell of dust hanging in the air. The apartment was completely empty, no furniture, no signs of life. "See," he said, spreading his arms. "Nothing here." I nodded, feeling embarrassed. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the building settling, like he'd said. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next few nights were quiet, and I started to relax, thinking it had all been in my head. Then, one evening, I came home to find my apartment door ajar. My stomach dropped. I was certain I'd locked it when I left. I pushed the door open cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment was just as I'd left it, nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. But the air felt different, heavier, as if someone had been there. I called the landlord, who came up and inspected the door. There were no signs of forced entry, and the lock was intact. "Maybe you just forgot to lock it," he suggested. I nodded, though I knew that wasn't true. I never forgot. That night, the laughter returned. It was louder than ever, echoing through the walls and ceiling. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a broom and banged on the ceiling. "Who's up there?" I shouted. "This isn't funny." The laughter stopped immediately, replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there, gripping the broom, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, I heard it, the faint creak of a floorboard, followed by a single word, whispered so softly I almost didn't hear it, "Downstairs." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The word repeated, louder this time, "Downstairs." I dropped the broom and backed away, my mind racing. It wasn't coming from above anymore. It was coming from inside my apartment. I grabbed my phone and ran into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, trying to explain what was happening. The dispatcher stayed on the line, her calm voice a lifeline as I waited for the police to arrive. When they got there, they found no one in the apartment. The doors were locked, the windows secured. The officers searched the entire building, including the vacant apartment upstairs, but there was no sign of an intruder. The only thing they found was a single set of footprints in the dust on the floor of the upstairs apartment. The prints led from the far corner of the room to the door, then stopped abruptly. I moved out the next week, breaking my lease and leaving most of my things behind. I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. I never found out who, or what, was responsible for the laughter, the footsteps, the whispered word. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that apartment and the empty room upstairs, and I wonder if someone new is living there now, hearing the same laughter, feeling the same dread. And I wonder if they'll have the sense to leave before it's too late. It was the summer of 2019, and I was house-sitting for my aunt and uncle while they were on a week-long cruise. Their home was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, rows of identical houses with neatly trimmed lawns, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. I was 20 at the time, a college student looking for a little extra cash, and I figured it'd be an easy gig. Feed the dog, water the plants, and enjoy a week of having the house to myself. The first couple of days were uneventful. Their golden retriever, Daisy, was a sweet, lazy dog who spent most of her time napping by the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The house was spacious, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light, and at night, I'd curl up on the couch with a movie and a bowl of popcorn, enjoying the solitude. But on the third night, things started to feel off. It was around 10 p.m. when I first noticed it. I was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, when I felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced out the window over the sink, but all I could see was the dark expanse of the backyard, lit only by the faint glow of the porch light. Daisy, who had been lying by the back door, suddenly perked up. Her ears went back, and a low growl rumbled in her throat. She stared at the sliding glass door, her body tense. "What is it, girl?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. I walked over to the door, peering out into the yard. The fence was secure, the gate locked, and there was no sign of movement. "Probably a raccoon," I muttered, pulling the curtains shut. Daisy didn't relax, though. She stayed by the door, her growling turning into soft, anxious whines. I tried to distract her with a treat, but she wouldn't budge. Eventually, I gave up and went to bed, leaving the door locked and the curtains drawn. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of Daisy barking. It was a frantic, high-pitched bark, the kind that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I grabbed my phone and hurried downstairs, my heart pounding. Daisy was at the back door, barking and scratching at the glass. The curtains were still drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something, or someone, on the other side. My breath caught in my throat as I inched closer, trying to make out what it was. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It stood perfectly still, its shape barely visible through the thin fabric of the curtains. I reached for the kitchen light switch, flipping it on, and for a brief moment, I saw them. A man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothing and a hood that obscured most of his face. He was pressed up against the glass, his hands cupped around his eyes as if he were trying to see inside. I screamed, grabbing Daisy's collar and pulling her back as I fumbled with my phone to call 911. When I looked back at the door, the man was gone. The police arrived within 10 minutes, but by then, there was no sign of the intruder. They checked the backyard and the surrounding area but found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. "He probably saw the dog and got spooked," one of the officers said. "Just keep your doors locked, and call us if anything else happens. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and shadow. Daisy stayed by my side, her ears twitching at the slightest sound. By morning, I convinced myself it was just a random trespasser, someone looking for an easy target who hadn't expected a dog, or a screaming woman. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it started with the motion-activated porch light. I was watching TV in the living room when the light flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows across the backyard. Daisy, who had been dozing on the rug, shot up and ran to the back door, barking furiously. I grabbed the flashlight my uncle had left by the door and stepped onto the porch, my hand shaking as I shone the beam into the yard. The light swept across the grass, the fence, the trees, but there was nothing there. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. The only response was the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I turned to go back inside, but as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, a faint, deliberate tapping. It was coming from the side of the house, near the window to the guest bedroom. My heart raced as I followed the sound, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. When I reached the window, I stopped. The tapping had stopped, too, but I could feel it, someone was on the other side of the glass. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Daisy was barking non-stop now, her fur bristling as she darted between the door and the window. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what was happening. By the time they arrived, the intruder was gone, again. This time, they found footprints in the flower bed beneath the window, but they didn't lead anywhere. It was like the person had vanished into thin air. The rest of the week passed in a blur of anxiety. I stayed up every night, the lights on, Daisy by my side. The intruder didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the porch light, set my nerves on edge. When my aunt and uncle returned, I told them everything. They were concerned but ultimately dismissed it as a random prowler, someone who'd moved on once they realized the house wasn't an easy target. But I knew it was more than that. The way the men had stood at the door, the deliberate tapping at the window, it wasn't random. It felt purposeful, like he was testing me, trying to see how far he could push before I broke. I haven't house-sat for anyone since. Every time I'm home alone, I keep the doors locked, the curtains drawn, and Daisy close by. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself listening for that faint tapping, wondering if he's still out there, waiting. It was a cold Friday evening in late November when I first started to feel uneasy. My parents were away for the weekend, attending a wedding in another state, and I had the house to myself. It wasn't the first time they'd left me alone, and at 17, I'd grown accustomed to managing just fine. But something about that night felt off. The house was an old colonial, creaky and drafty, with a basement that seemed to absorb sound and light. I'd always found the basement unsettling, with its low ceilings, exposed pipes, and the single bare bulb that cast long, shifting shadows across the concrete walls. Still, I didn't have any reason to go down there, so I focused on making the most of my evening. I ordered a pizza, queued up my favorite show, and settled onto the couch in the living room. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the warmth of the fireplace and the flicker of the TV were enough to make me feel safe. I'd just finished my second slice when I heard it, a faint thud, almost imperceptible, coming from below. At first, I thought it might be the old boiler kicking on, but something about the sound made me pause. It wasn't mechanical. It was deliberate. Like the sound of something, or someone, moving down there. I muted the TV and strained to listen. Another thud, followed by a faint scraping noise, echoed up from the basement. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was probably nothing, just the old pipes or the wind, but a part of me wasn't convinced. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and crept toward the basement door. The air felt colder as I approached, and the faint smell of damp concrete seeped through the crack under the door. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, before finally pulling it open. The basement stairs loomed before me, descending into darkness. I stood there for a moment, my flashlight beam barely cutting through the gloom, when I heard it again, a soft, shuffling sound, closer this time. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. Logic told me it was nothing, but fear whispered otherwise. I texted my mom, asking if she'd ever heard strange noises from the basement, but she didn't reply. I put on some music to drown out the unease and forced myself to focus on my show. An hour later, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. The pizza was gone, and the warmth of the fire had lulled me into a sense of calm. That's when the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. The house fell silent except for the relentless wind outside. My phone's flashlight was my only source of light as I fumbled for the circuit breaker. My parents had told me it was in the basement, which meant I had no choice but to go down there. Armed with a flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other, I opened the basement door again. The air that wafted up was colder than before, heavy with the smell of mildew. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The flashlight beam swept across the cluttered basement, illuminating shelves of old tools, boxes of forgotten belongings, and the hulking shadow of the boiler. I found the breaker panel on the far wall and hurried over, flipping the switches back into place. The lights flickered on, and I let out a sigh of relief. As I turned to head back upstairs, something caught my eye, a movement in the corner of the basement, just at the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat as I swung the flashlight toward it. There was nothing there. Telling myself I was just imagining things, I bolted up the stairs and locked the basement door behind me. I didn't care how much power I used. I turned on every light in the house and sat on the couch, trying to shake the unease. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before heading upstairs. But as I climbed into bed, a noise stopped me in my tracks, a low, rhythmic tapping, coming from the floorboards below. I froze, listening as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was coming from inside the walls. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling as I explained the situation to the operator. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if whatever was making it wanted me to know it was there. The police arrived 20 minutes later. By the time they entered the house, the tapping had stopped. They searched the basement, the walls, and the attic but found no signs of an intruder. Still, one of the officers mentioned that the old house had plenty of crawl spaces, places where someone could hide for days without being noticed. They advised me to stay somewhere else for the night, but I was too shaken to even consider going back down to my car. Instead, I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the bat until morning. When my parents returned the next day, they dismissed the noises as the quirks of an old house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone that night, that something, or someone, had been watching me from the shadows. To this day, I can't walk into a basement without feeling that same chill, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.